catch his sense of humor.
Shoelaces, huh? You're in trouble now.
Yeah, right.
Aren't you afraid sitting that close to me? What the hell? Oh, this is too long. You don't need it this long. Okay. I had a rosary, which I carried in my pocket. I've always carried a rosary. It was my communion rosary. They said, well, what kind of a knot do you use? I said, what do you mean knot? When I tie things up? I says, depending on what I'm using it for, I said, the only thing I ever learned from Boy Scouts is a tourniquet knot. He said, well, show us what that is. So I took, at that time, and again, it's together, but in order to demonstrate it here, I took the rosary and I said, well, here, you put it around. This is hard trying to do this. Why don't you put your hand out? Okay, here. What I told him, I said, here, all you do is you wrap it around, you put one knot in it. And I said, then you put a second knot in it. Okay? Mm-hmm. I said, then you take a stick and stick it in here, and you just turn this. And I said, it causes a tourniquet. I said, that's the only knot I ever learned.
Precisely the kind of knot found on the ropes wrapped around the necks of the victims found under the house on Summerdale.
John Gacy was born on March the 17th, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the second of 3 children and the only son to be born to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Robinson. From the age of 4, Gacy was verbally and physically abused by his alcoholic father, but despite the abuse, Gacy admired his father and constantly wanted his approval. In return, his father would throw insults at him, telling him he was stupid and acted girlish. When Gacy was 7 years old, he was molested repeatedly by a friend of the family, but he never told his parents about it, fearing that his father would find him at the fault and that he would be severely punished. When Gacy was in elementary school, he was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition which limited his physical activity. As a result, he became overweight and endured teasing from his classmates. At age 11, Gacy was hospitalized for several months at a time after experiencing unexplained blackouts. His father decided Gacy was faking the blackouts because the doctors were unable to diagnose why it was happening. But after 5 years of being in and out of hospital, it was discovered that he had a blood clot in his brain, which was also treated. But Gacy's delicate health issues failed to protect him from his father's drunken self. He received regular beatings for no particular reason other than his father to belittle him. But after years of abuse, Gacy taught himself not to cry. This was the only thing he consciously ever did that he knew would provoke his father's anger. Gacy found it too difficult to catch up with what he had missed in school when he was hospitalized, so he decided to drop out. His being as a high school dropout solidified his father's consistent accusations that Gacy was stupid. At the age of 18, Gacy was still living with his parents. He became involved with the Democratic Party and worked as an assistant precinct captain. It was during this time that he began to develop his gift for gab. He enjoyed the positive attention he received in what he felt was a prestigious position, but his father quickly silenced whatever good came out of his political involvement. He belittled Gacy's association with the party and called him a party patsy. Gacy's years of abuse from his father finally wore down on him, but after several episodes of his father having refused to let Gacy use his own car, he had enough. He then packed his belongings and escaped to Las Vegas, Nevada. In Las Vegas, Gacy worked for an ambulance service for a short period of time, but was then transferred to a morgue where he was employed as an attendant. He often spent nights alone at the morgue, where he would sleep on the cot near the embalming room. On the last night Gacy worked there, he got into a coffin and fondled the corpse of a teenage boy, but afterwards, he was so confused and shocked by the realization that he'd been sexually aroused by the male corpse, that he had called his mother the following day, and without providing details, he asked if he could return home. His father agreed, and Gacy, who had only been gone for 90 days, quit his job at the morgue and drove back to Chicago. Back in Chicago, Gacy forced himself to bury the experience at the morgue and move forward. Despite not having finished high school, he was accepted at Northwestern's Business College, where he had graduated in 1963. He then took a management trainee position with the NUNN Shoe Company, and after a short period of time, he was transferred to Springfield, Illinois, where he was promoted to a management position. Marlon Mears was employed at the same store and worked in Gacy's department. The two began dating, and 9 months later, they married. During his first year in Springfield, Gacy had become very involved with the local JCs, dedicating much of his spare time to the organisation. He became adept at self-promotion, utilising his salesmanship training to gain positive attention. He rose through the JC ranks, and in April 1964, he was awarded with the title of Key Man. Fundraising was Gacy's niche, and by 1965, he was appointed Vice President for the JC Springfield Division, and later that same year, he was recognised as being the third most outstanding JC in the state of Illinois. But for the first time in his life, Gacy felt confident and full of self-esteem. He was married and had a good future before him, and had persuaded people he was a leader. But only one thing threatened his success, and that was growing the need to be sexually involved with young male teens. After dating in Springfield, Illinois, Gacy and Marlene married in September 1964 in Waterloo, Iowa, and that was where Gacy managed 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by Marilyn's father. The newlyweds moved into Marilyn's parents' home, rent-free. Gacy soon joined the Waterloo JCs, and once again quickly moved up the ranks. In 1967, he received recognition as the outstanding vice president of the Waterloo JCs, and earned a seat on the board of directors. But unlike in Springfield, the Waterloo JCs had a dark side that involved illegal drug use, wife swapping, prostitutes, and pornography. But Gacy slid right into the position of managing and regularly participating in these activities. Gacy also began to act on his desires to have sex with male teenagers, many of whom worked at the fried chicken restaurants that he managed. He turned a basement room into a hangout as a way to attract teens. He would entice the boys with free alcohol and pornography. Gacy would then take sexual advantage of some of the boys after they become too intoxicated to put up any resistance. While Gacy was molesting teens in his basement and doing drugs with his JC pals, Marlene was busy having children. Their first child was born a boy, born in 1967, and the second child was a girl, born a year later. Gacy later described this time of his life as being nearly perfect. It was also the only time he'd finally gained any approval from his father. A common trait shared by many serial killers is their belief that they are smarter than anyone, and they believe that they will never get caught. Gacy fitted that profile. With his above-average earnings and his social connections through JCs, Gacy's ego and confidence level grew. He became pushy and commanding, and would often brag about his accomplishments, most of which were transparent lies. The JC members, who were not into hookers and porn, began putting a distance between themselves and Gacy, or the Colonel, as he insisted on being called. But in March 1968, Gacy's near-perfect world quickly fell apart. In August 1967, Gacy had hired 15-year-old Donald Voorhees to do odd jobs around his house. Donald met Gacy through his father, who was also in the JCs. After finishing his work, Gacy lured the teen into his basement with the promise of free beer and porn movies. After Gacy supplied him with the abundance of alcohol, he forced him into having oral sex. This experience seemed to unplug any fears Gacy had about getting caught, but over the next several months, he sexually abused several other teenage boys. He convinced some of them that a scientific research program that he was involved in was looking for participants, and that they would be paid $50 for each session. He also used blackmail as a way to force them into sexual submission. But in March 1968, it all came crashing down on Gacy. Voorhees told his father about the incident with Gacy in his basement, who immediately reported it to the police. Another 16-year-old victim also reported Gacy to the police. Gacy was arrested and charged with oral sodomy of the 15-year-old and attempted assault of the other boy, charges that he had strongly denied. As his defense, Gacy said the accusations were a lie by Voorhees' father, who tried to sabotage his efforts to become president of the Iowa JCs. Some of his JC friends believed it was possible. However, despite his protests, Gacy was indicted on the sodomy charges. In an effort to intimidate Voorhees and keep him from testifying, Gacy paid an employee, 18-year-old Russell Schroeder, $300 to beat up the teenager and warn him against showing up in court. Voorhees went straight to the police, who arrested Schroeder. He promptly admitted his guilt and Gacy's involvement to the police. Gacy was charged with conspiracy assault. By the time it was over, Gacy pled guilty to the sodomy and received a 10-year sentence. On December the 27th, 1969, Gacy's father died of cirrhosis of the liver. The news hit Gacy hard, but despite his obvious poor emotional state, the prison officials denied his request to attend his father's funeral. Gacy did everything right in prison. He earned his high school degree and took his position as head cook seriously. His good behaviour paid off. In October 1971, after completing just 2 years of his sentence, he was released and placed on probation for 12 months. Marlin filed for a divorce whilst Gacy was in prison. He was so angered by the divorce that he had told her that she and the 2 children were dead to him, vowing never to see them again. Marlin, no doubt, hoped that he would stick to his word. With nothing to return to in Waterloo, Gacy moved back to Chicago to begin rebuilding his life. He moved in with his mother and got a job working as a cook, and then worked for a construction contractor. Gacy later bought a home 30 miles outside of Chicago, in Des Plaines, Illinois. Gacy and his mother lived in the house, which was part of the terms of Gacy's probation. In early February 1971, Gacy lured a teenage boy into his home and tried to rape him, but the boy escaped and went to the police. Gacy was charged with sexual assault, but the charges were dismissed when the teen did not show up in court. Word of his arrest never got back to his parole officer. On January 2nd, 1972, Timothy Jack McCoy, aged 16, was planning on sleeping at a bus terminal in Chicago. His next bus wasn't scheduled until the following day, but when Gacy approached him and offered to give him a tour of the city, plus letting him sleep in his house, McCoy took him up on it. According to Gacy's account, he awoke the following morning and saw McCoy standing with a knife at his bedroom door. Gacy thought the teen intended on killing him, so he charged the boy and got control of the knife. Gacy then stabbed the teen to death, but afterwards, he realised that he had been mistaken of McCoy's intentions. The teen had the knife because he was preparing breakfast and had gone to Gacy's room to wake him up. Although Gacy had not planned to kill McCoy, when he brought him home, he couldn't dismiss the fact that he'd become sexually aroused at the point of orgasm during the kill. In fact, killing was the most intense sexual pleasure that he had ever felt. Timothy Jack McCoy was the first of many to be buried in the crawl space under Gacy's home. On July 1st, 1972, Gacy married a high school sweetheart, Carol Hoff. She and her 2 daughters from a previous marriage moved into Gacy's home. Carol was aware why Gacy had spent time in prison, but had downplayed the charges and convinced herself that he had changed his ways. Within weeks of being married, Gacy was arrested and charged with sexual assault after a teen male accused him of impersonating a police officer to get him into his car, then forcing him to engage in oral sex. But again, the charges were dropped, this time because the victim had tried to blackmail Gacy. In the meantime, as Gacy added more bodies into the crawl space under his house, a horrible stench began to fill the air, both inside and outside of Gacy's home. But it got so bad that the neighbours began to insist that Gacy was to do something to get rid of the odour. In 1974, Gacy left his construction job and started a contracting business called Painting, Decorating and Maintenance, or PDM Contractors. Gacy told his friends that one way he planned to keep his costs down was by hiring teenage boys, but Gacy saw it as another way to find teens to lure them into his basement of horrors. He began posting available jobs and then invited the applicants into his house on the pretext of talking to them about a job. Once the boys were inside his home, he would overpower them using various tricks, render them unconscious, and then begin his gruesome and sadistic torture that almost led them to their death. While he wasn't killing young men, Gacy spent time re-establishing himself as a good neighbour and a good community leader. He worked tirelessly on community projects, and through a lot of neighbourhood parties, developed close friends with his next-door neighbours, and became a familiar face dressed up as Pogo the Clown, which was at birthday parties and at children's hospitals. People like Wayne Gacy by day. He was a successful business owner and a community do-gooder, but by night he was unknown to anyone but his victims. He was a sadistic killer on the loose. In October 1975, Carol filed for a divorce after Gacy admitted to her that he was attracted to young men. She wasn't surprised by the news. Months before on Mother's Day, he had informed her that they would not be having any more sex together. She was also bothered by all the gay porn magazines lying around, and she could no longer ignore all the teenage males coming in and out of the house. Having Carol out of his hair, Gacy focused on what really mattered to him the most, keeping his do-gooder facade in the community so that he could continue to achieve sexual gratification by raping and killing young boys. From 1976 to 1978, Gacy had managed to hide the bodies of 29 of his victims under his house. but because of the lack of space and the odor, he dumped the bodies of his 4 last victims in the Des Moines River. On December the 11th, 1978, in Des Moines, 15-year-old Robert PIEST went missing after leaving his job at the pharmacy. He told his mother and co-worker that he was going out to talk to a construction contractor about a summer position. The contractor had been in the pharmacy earlier in the evening, discussing a future remodel with the owner. When PIEST failed to return home, his parents contacted the police. The pharmacy owner told the investigators the contractor was John Wayne Gacy, owner of PDM Contractors. When Gacy was contacted by the police, he admitted being in the pharmacy on the night the boy disappeared, but denied ever speaking to the teenager. This contradicted what one of PIEST's fellow employees had told the investigators. According to the employee, PIEST was upset because he had been turned down earlier in the evening when he asked for a pay rise. But when his shift ended, he was excited because the contractor that was remodeling the pharmacy agreed to meet with him that night to discuss a summer job. Gacy's denying that he had ever spoken to the boy raised a lot of suspicion. Investigators ran a background check that revealed Gacy's past criminal record, including his conviction and prison time for sodomizing a minor. This information also put Gacy on top of the list of possible suspects. But on December the 13th, 1978, a warrant to search Gacy's Summerdale Avenue home was granted. While investigators searched his home and cars, he was at the police station given an oral and written statement about his activities at the pharmacy on the night PIEST disappeared. When he found out that his house had been searched, he went into a fit of anger. The evidence collected at Gacy's house included a class of 1975 high school ring with initials JAS, handcuffs, drugs and drug paraphernalia, 2 driver's licenses that were not issued to Gacy, child pornography, police badges, guns and ammunition, a switchblade, a piece of stained carpet, hair samples from Gacy's cars, store receipts, and several items of teen-styled clothing in sizes that would not fit Gacy. Investigators also went down into the crawl space, but did not discover anything and left quickly due to the rancid odor that they attributed to being a sewage problem. Although the search solidified suspicions that Gacy was likely an active paedophile, it did not turn up any evidence linking him to PIEST. However, he was still their prime suspect. 2 surveillance teams were assigned to watch Gacy 24 hours a day. The investigators continued their search for PIEST and continued interviewing his friends and co-worker. They also began interviewing people who had contact with Gacy. What investigators learned was Robert PIEST was a good, family-orientated kid. John Gacy, on the other hand, had the makings of a monster. They also learned that PIEST was not the first, but the 4th person who had disappeared after having contact with Gacy. But meanwhile, Gacy seemed to be enjoying the game of cat and mouse with the surveillance team. More than once was he able to sneak away from his house undetected. He also invited the team into his home and served them breakfast, then would joke about spending the rest of the day getting rid of dead bodies. 8 days into the investigation, the lead detective went into the PIEST home to bring his parents up to date. During the conversation, Mrs. PIEST mentioned a conversation that she had with one of the employees working on the night her son went missing. The employee had told her that she had borrowed her son's jacket when she went out on her break and left a receipt in the jacket's pocket. This was the same jacket that her son had on when he had left to go to talk to the contractor about the job and never returned. But the same receipt was found in the evidence collected during the search of Gacy's house. Further forensic tests were performed on the receipt, and it proved that Gacy had been lying that PIEST had been in his home. Those closest to Gacy were interviewed by detectives on multiple occasions, but afterwards, Gacy demanded that they tell him everything that was said. This included the in-depth questioning of his employees regarding the crawl space under Gacy's home. Some of these employees admitted that Gacy had paid them to go into specific areas of the crawl space to dig trenches, but Gacy realized it was just a matter of time before the extent of his crimes would be exposed. He began to buckle under the pressure, and his behavior turned bizarre. On the morning of his arrest, Gacy was observed driving to the homes of his friends to tell them goodbye. He was seen taking pills and drinking mid-morning. He also talked about committing suicide and confessed to a few people that he'd killed 30 people. What finally led to his arrest was a drug deal that Gacy orchestrated in full view of the surveillance team. They pulled Gacy over and placed him under arrest. While in police custody, Gacy was informed that a second search warrant of his house had been issued. The news brought on chest pains, and Gacy was taken to hospital. In the meantime, the search of his house, particularly in the crawl space, had begun, but the extent of what would be uncovered shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Gacy was released from hospital later that night and taken back into custody. Knowing that his game was up, he confessed to murdering Robert PIEST. He also confessed to 32 additional murders, starting in 1978. During the confession, Gacy explained how he restrained his victims by pretending to do a magic trick, which required that they put on handcuffs. He then stuffed socks or underwear in their mouths and used a board with chains, which he would then place under their chest, then wrap the chains around their neck. He would then choke them to death whilst raping them. Gacy went on trial on February the 6th, 1980, for the murder of 33 young men. His defense lawyers tried to prove that Gacy was insane, but the jury of 5 women and 7 men did not agree. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, and Gacy was given the death penalty. While on death row, Gacy continued to taunt authorities with different versions of his stories about the murders in an attempt to stay alive. But once his appeals were exhausted, the execution date was set. John Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May the 9th, 1994. His last words were, "Kiss my ass."